Well, it's a big week in history coming up. The 75th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. It happened on February the 15th, 1942. So the actual day is next Wednesday. Now, you'll hear it talked about in different ways across ABC Radio. We'd like to kick off this morning with a bit of context because that event is hugely significant for Australia's international alliances. It marked the beginning of the end of our dependence on Britain and the beginning of our alliance with the US. And isn't that at a critical stage again under President Trump? Joining me to discuss the geopolitical legacy of the fall of Singapore and the pivot that Australia made at that point is historian David Day, who's written, among numerous books, a biography of Prime Minister John Curtin and a book called The Politics of War about the Second World War. Hello, David.
Hello, Geraldine.
And Ewan Graham is the Director of International Security at the Lowy Institute. We spoke to him, you might recall, last year after he wrote a paper on the Singapore-Australian relationship. Welcome back to Saturday Extra, Ewan.
Good to be with you, Geraldine.
Now, we'll discuss further in a minute, but first, let's listen to this cataclysmic moment in time.
Men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan. That has happened because in the first instance, Japanese naval and air forces launched an unprovoked attack on British and United States territory. Because our vital interests are in peril, and because the rights of free people in the whole Pacific are assailed.
From Singapore, there are reports of intensified raids by Japanese aircraft, but no details are given. An agency correspondent says that all last night the guns of the fortress roared across the narrow Johor Straits, bombarding the roads and railways on the mainland.
Tonight, I speak to you at home. I speak to you in Australia and New Zealand, for whose safety we will strain every nerve. To our loyal friends in India and Burma, to our gallant allies, the Dutch and Chinese, and to our kith and kin in the United States, I speak to you all under the shadow of a heavy and far-reaching military defeat. It is a British and imperial defeat. Singapore has fallen.
I'm not sure I speak for you all, but I tell you what, that certainly gives me some shivers. It was, of course, Churchill at the end, Prime Minister John Curtin at the start, announcing we were at war with Japan. Now, Ewan Graham, you've lived in Singapore, and there's still evidence of those terrible days, is there?
There is. I used to live in close to Bukit Timah, where the surrender was signed in the Ford factory. It's still there and serves as a museum now. And I would regularly go walking around where the old water pipeline ran from Malaysia down to the centre of Singapore, and still regularly bullets get turned up there. It's a sad but poignant reminder that the fall of Singapore was contested, that there was actually a great deal of fighting, bloody fighting on the island.
Does Singapore mark this event?
Yes, it does, and it serves a broader political purpose for Singapore that's still commemorated every year. As Total Defence Day. So it's a reminder of what can happen when you let your guard down. That's the message that the Singapore government, I think, serves to deliver to its own population as well as recording the history.
Yes. David Day, the defeat is seen as a massive stuff-up, isn't it, on Britain's part, the worst military disaster of the 20th century. Was that seen straight away and by everyone, by the way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you talk about having the shivers now listening to it, but of course, this was the greatest psychological shock that the Australian nation has ever suffered, because our whole defence policy in the 20s and 30s was based around Singapore being both defended and having a British fleet there. And never got the British fleet, and the base sort of fell within 2 months of Pearl Harbor. So Australia now faced invasion. The front door was open.
I mean, there'd been a growing feeling, hadn't there, leading up to this, that if there was war in the Pacific, Britain might not be much use to Australia. How accepted was that? And was that just about distance?
Well, this was the big argument in the 1930s between Labor and the United Australia Party, the Conservatives. The Conservatives wanted to put all their money in the British basket and spend all the money on the Australian Navy, whereas Curtin, as Labor leader, argued that Australia needed to defend itself, needed to defend the Australian continent, and needed to spend most of its defence pounds on aircraft, because they'd be able to stop an invasion fleet, and we shouldn't rely on the British being able to defend us.
And there's still a lot of debate, I understand, among historians about Britain's culpability. What is your take?
Well, I mean, I wrote a book called The Great Betrayal, which then became part of the politics of war. And when I was researching this, which was my PhD, I was really shocked looking at the archives in England at all the promises and how small Australia bulked in British eyes. We thought we were the jewel in the British crown, but looking from London, of course, it's India. And we think of Singapore as being there for our defence, but Singapore was the gateway to the Indian Ocean to protect India. That was what it was mainly about in British eyes.
And you and Graham, how do you view Britain's role? Because it affects what happens next, doesn't it? That's why I'm asking.
Well, there is still a broader resonance to it. Churchill, of course, who we heard just now in your excerpt, described it in the House of Commons as the greatest disaster in British arms which our history records, so he didn't mince his words. What he wanted was, if it was going to be a defeat, at least a glorious defeat, one that would serve the broader morale. It was the collapse of 85,000 men taken prisoner on the island, of I think a further 50,000 during the Malayan campaign. Nothing comes close to that, under the twin threat of Japan, but also an existential threat to the homeland.
Yes, they were fighting Germany and Italy and Japan at the time. They were rather busy, I suppose, it has to be said.
Well, the naval resources that were there in Singapore included an aircraft carrier and a submarine flotilla, but they were all pulled back to the Mediterranean, leaving the Repulse and the Prince of Wales effectively unguarded.
And look, what is interesting in this, I mean to say, if you start to go back, David, it is very, very interesting, because there's quite a lot of controversy around defeat in Singapore, and quite a sensitive point among historians about whether it was the Australian line in particular that collapsed. I mean, this is so sensitive, I can imagine listeners taking this in, that some Australians ran away, allowing the Japanese forces to sort of just rush down the peninsula. How do you see it?
Look, there was no Australian running away on the peninsula. The controversy really erupted around the Australians holding the line on the island itself. And
on Singapore itself?
Yeah, on Singapore Island itself, and that the Japanese got their first lodgement in that area.
And what do you think? Go on.
I think they were in an impossible position. The Japanese controlled the air. That defeat was absolutely inevitable. Without sea power or air power, Singapore was doomed. And I think people were just overwhelmed by the soldiers on the ground were overwhelmed by the Japanese tactics of encircling, going around behind and cutting off the troops. So there was a certain amount of panic, in particular when the skies are full of Japanese planes.
Yes.
And then you had Australian soldiers, in some cases, forcing themselves onto the last evacuation ships at gunpoint, which didn't go down well in Britain when word reached there.
Just let me tell listeners that David Day, historian, and Ewan Graham, who is more of a political analyst, as he said, but we're looking very much at the fall of Singapore in terms of it being the experience of having to change our alliance partners, the only one we've really got. And the argument is that maybe we're being asked to think about that right now. I mean, just 4 days after the fall of Singapore, David, the Japanese began bombing Darwin. And Curtin had predicted Australia was next, hadn't he?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the big lesson for me from Singapore is that Britain was faced with choices. And certainly it was facing an existential threat to Britain itself, although it had fought that off in 1940. But when it had to make choices as to where it was going to concentrate its forces, it had to choose between the Middle East, India and Australia. And Australia was last on the list. So the lesson for me is that Australia really has to look to its own interests first, that it cannot rely on the promises of great power protectors, whether it be Britain or America, because in whatever case it is, those protectors will look to their own interests first.
Especially when they're fully stretched, you're suggesting.
Yeah, and that may or may not court, well, even when they're not, over East Timor. America didn't come in behind us over East Timor, for instance.
And of course, he then made this extraordinary announcement that we would no longer be relying on Great Britain, and he placed Australian forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, and this is really the beginning of the Australian-American, the alliance, which is now very much in the news. That is what intrigued us. What is involved in doing that? When a country wants to switch military allegiance and perceived national security is at stake, how is it actually done, David?
Well, this was only for the duration of the war. It was never intended that Australia would then be part of the American sphere of influence, as it were. And towards the end of the war, Australia was very much inclined to go back into the British embrace. And even into the 1960s, it was seeking to have Britain set up a base in Darwin when it was talking about withdrawing from Singapore. So Australia was very wary about the United States by the end of the war, because America was making decisions that were impacting on the Australian economy, on the Australian post-war reconstruction, because it was denying Australia various aircraft and such forth that would allow us to get back to peacetime production.
Right. Yes, it wasn't a complete cutting of the military ties either with Britain, was it, Ewan? Which quite surprised me.
Indeed not. And to go further back, to David's point that the jewel in the crown was India, well, the longest continually engaged front in the Pacific was that Burma campaign. Now, it was run on a shoestring, but eventually...
That was Mountbatten, wasn't it? The Duke of Edinburgh's uncle.
Yeah, indeed. And Slim, the eventual victorious general, who rolled up the Japanese positions wholesale in Burma towards the end of the...
Marvellous Australian general.
But after the war, it's often forgotten that Britain came back, and there were two very significant Commonwealth actions in which Singapore served as a very important forward base. The emergency, the counterinsurgency against the communist forces in Malaya.
Confrontasi.
And then confrontation was the second one. And again, Commonwealth forces, Australia, New Zealand and the UK were all continuously engaged. And that takes us more or less up to the point at which the East of Suez decision was taken, and then Britain did leave for a second time.
1956. Let's talk now then about how the fall of Singapore changed the way we saw ourselves, because, it wasn't just about military ties, was it, David? It marked the beginning, pretty traumatic, I think, I'll check with you, of a cultural shift as well.
Yeah, that cultural shift was already starting in the 20s and 30s, particularly with Hollywood making big inroads into Australian cinema audiences. But there was a shift towards greater self-reliance in Australia. And if you recall, we emerged from the war with 2 aircraft carriers. We'd never had that before. So that was a much more powerful navy that we'd ever had. And also with an idea that we could create our own little sub-empire in the South Pacific. If we could establish bases in Australian New Guinea and Papua New Guinea and have a base in Manus, we opposed the idea of America remaining on Manus Island as a naval base because we wanted it for ourselves.
So maybe I'm wrong to use the word traumatic. Maybe there was actually a pride coming here, possibly even by the sound of you, a little bit of hubris.
Well, it was certainly traumatic in 42. There's no getting away from that. But by 43, 44, Australia was looking forward to projecting a much more powerful image on the world. It had been putting together 4-engine bomber aircraft, Lincoln bombers, for the first time. This was much more powerful than Australia had ever had before. Prior to the war, it didn't have any modern fighters, no bombers, no tanks, no nothing. And now it was assembling tanks, 4-engine bombers, modern fighter aircraft, and was looking forward to taking control of aircraft carriers.
My mother actually worked on some of that aircraft assembly, so I do know about this. Now, here's how Prime Minister Paul Keating, very early in his term in 1992, positioned the fall of Singapore. I think it's interesting to hear. We were let down by Britain, as Keating saw it, and yet, as he saw it, the Menzies 1950s government was still toadying to Britain. Well, here he is, setting the tone for many more years of this sort of rhetoric.
I tell you, I learned one thing. I learned about self-respect and self-regard for Australia. Not about some cultural cringe to a country which decided not to defend the Malaysian Peninsula, not to worry about Singapore, not to give us our troops back to keep ourselves free from Japanese domination. This was the country that you people wedded yourself to, and even as they walked out on you and joined the common market, you were still looking for your MBEs and your knighthoods and all the rest of the regalia that come with it. You would take Australia right back down the time tunnel to the cultural cringe where you've always come from. And that's why your Fight Back document has exactly...
Order! There is far too much noise. Order! Members on my left, the member for Dundas will cease interjecting. I think the member for Bennelong is going to have a heart attack if his face goes any redder, so he might cease interjecting too. Mr. Speaker, and members on my right will cease interjecting as well.
Isn't that great theatre? Keating went on to say, David Day, that Menzies and Casey were not aggressively proud of our culture. I wonder what you think. Did it take the fall of Singapore to make us aggressively proud of our culture?
Well, I think it did have long-term effects, and I wouldn't go all the way with Paul Keating on that. I think Britain did what it had to do with its scarce resources, and spent most of those closer to home. And the great betrayal, as I see it, from Britain was to encourage Australia to put all its eggs into the naval basket so that Britain could use them and deploy them in the Mediterranean or wherever it wanted, rather than tell Australia to defend itself.
Let me ask you, Ewan, Singapore obviously went through incredible times with occupation, etc., and is emerging now in, as you said, a whole different light. It's becoming more and more strategically important to Australia, isn't it? And I mean, in this pivot that we're being asked to consider now, where do you think it fits in?
Yes, I think so. We have grown very used over the last 15 years in particular to the military contributions being made well outside of our region to Afghanistan and the Middle East. Again, it's the parallels are there. It's commitment to a global defence that has echoes of that imperial defence system. But now it's very clear that the emerging peer competitor to the United States is China, and that Southeast Asia and the Pacific will be seen increasingly as areas of direct strategic concern in which Australia is expected to put its resources and play its part in the role division within the alliance.
I mean, if the Southeast Asian area is going to become more important, and everyone's looking, of course, to the South China Sea, a little bit more to the north, what I'm getting from this is we're going to have more diffuse but very, very important military relationships, aren't we, with people like Singapore and Indonesia and Vietnam and Malaysia. This is a much... And Japan, of course, Japan, ironically. So this is a trickier sort of relationship than either with Britain or the US, isn't it?
But I think no one loses out of it. You could look at it as a hedge against a more aggressive China in future, but in a way you can also say it's a hedge against a more uncertain American commitment too. And I think because of that, it's perfect logic to put our limited resources into developing, as you say, those network of bilateral relations. But the overall effect is to sort of enmesh the region, and it enmeshes it in a way that makes it much more difficult for great powers to sort of pick off the smaller and medium powers one by one. And that's how middle power smartly uses the limited resources that it has.
And just finally, in that, if we did do that lovely hybrid set of alliances we're talking about, we might even be taking sort of the semi-lead, mightn't we? That would be a real shock for us.
But then it goes back to history again. I mean, I think the point is geography doesn't change. And it's a home truth that our defence interest should be framed primarily in terms of what the near regions are to us. That's the South Pacific, Indonesia, the archipelago, radiating out to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. Now, there is a global element to that comes on top. And again, history doesn't change that much. Australia depends its prosperity on exporting to a global system. Ultimately, it has a stake in that everywhere. But increasingly, I think the expectation is going to be that Australia is not just expected to do that by the United States. That's the wrong way to think of it. We should be thinking of it in terms of our own interests and also as a hedge against a less certain United States commitment to boost those linkages with the Southeast Asia and the like-minded countries.
And that, thank you very much indeed, Ewan Graham from the Lowy Institute, where he's Director of International Security, and David Day, before him, author and historian. He's written a biography which I went back to. I really commend it to you, on John Curtin, and a book called The Politics of War, about the Second World War. And I noticed that Peter Thompson, the journalist and broadcaster, wrote a book earlier in the 2000s called Pacific Fury, looking at precisely this. So you might like, if we've piqued your interest, I hope we have, you might like to check out some of that writing. And we, across ABC Radio, we will be commemorating this fall of Singapore. Check out a landmark RN series about POWs, for instance, under Japan, produced by Tim Bowden. And next week there'll be a range of special programs and a big broadcast that we're doing too, to commemorate the women who were part of the families of the 8,000 people who died under the Japanese after the fall of Singapore. So there's a lot happening. And of course, there's the current drama about putting aside land in the Shoalhaven for the use of Singapore and defence land. So it's really a very live issue.